I think that the pandemic has given us the opportunity to actually build back differently. And there's a huge difference between building back differently and building back better. In pursuing the idea of building back differently, we have to ask the question, we build back differently on what basis? And I'm suggesting that in considering the idea of building back differently, we base our discussions on the idea of care. And I see care as being undertaken in two ways. One is the idea of caring for, and this caring for often is linked to ideas of the care economy, i.e. those provided by domestic workers, childminders, and those in the caring professions for the elderly. And this idea of caring for, in my view, has become commodified, by which I mean they are now part of financial transactions. So if one assumes a scenario where there is no exploitation, say in wages or in working conditions, one can argue that one has fulfilled one's contract in terms of caring for. However, I am trying to argue that there is something beyond caring for, and this means caring about. And caring about means the understanding of the other. It's understanding the kind of experiences faced by others, and one of therefore developing compassion and solidarity. And when I talk about the other, I'm referring to the other through a whole range of differences, be they race, ethnicity, caste, class, gender, sexuality, or occupation, and the like. The idea of caring about is something that has been inculcated in me whilst I was growing up, not through compulsion, but through the idea of demonstration by my late parents. And hence the idea of caring about is part of my environmental DNA, if you'd like to call it that. And my politics as a result is about valuing others, most importantly for who they are as another human being, and not by the work that they do or the manner in which society has ranked them. And this ethics of caring about has, in the space of the education that I offer at the London School of Economics and Political Science, builds in not only caring about my students, but also inculcating in them the idea of caring about. And in doing so, my aim is to bring about ways of thinking differently, and hence the idea of building back differently has its foundations. I have been researching housing since the early 1980s, and over the last 5 years or so have been researching internal migration in relation to construction workers. The migrant workers that I researched in Chennai came from other states in India, mostly from the eastern seaboard. And they lived in camps on the construction site or close by. These were migrant construction workers working in large-scale construction projects, such as infrastructure, but also upmarket housing enclaves, as well as shopping malls and the construction of buildings for commercial purposes, including industry. And it struck me that construction underpins human existence, and all the social relationships and interactions we speak about takes place largely within the built environment. And these workers are hardly recognized in the contribution that they make. Unlike a film, and if one watches film credits at the end, everyone who was associated with the film in whatever way possible, no matter how small, is actually named in these credits. But in construction, one can find a plaque on a building that spells out the name of the architect and perhaps the structural consultants or the landscape architect. And the people who actually contributed to construction are a mirage as far as that is concerned. These workers are exploited in relation to the notion of caring for, I mean in relation to their conditions of work, wages, the lack of overtime payment, and their housing conditions are quite poor, lacking basic access to water and sanitation. There are a number of laws and regulations in India to cover migrant construction workers, their working conditions, as well as their living conditions. But these are ignored with impunity, largely due to the nexus between the state and the financial capital that developers bring with them. More recently, moves are afoot in terms of watering down these regulations and making them into codes, which are more likely to be based on the notion of a voluntary adoption rather than requirement through law. So there is an erosion in the sphere of caring for amongst the migrant workers that I researched. But there is also a lack of the notion of caring about. And when I mean caring about, I'm talking about, for example, knowing the construction worker by his or her name, having some understanding of the family circumstances, and also of considering them as human beings and extending some sense of compassion to their existence. Instead, these workers are treated as commodities to be hired and then dismissed when no longer needed. So what does building back differently say in relation to this research of mine on migrant construction workers? Definitely, it speaks to the need to remove forms of exploitation and extraction of labor that currently exists. But it also requires us to think about valuing their work beyond the financial transactions included in the idea of wages. So building back differently would actually mean rethinking the relationships between architects, developers, engineers, and the workers who they employ to bring their ideas to fruition. I'd like to conclude by suggesting things that we as individuals could do. And one of the biggest resources in the idea of caring about is one of time. Time to inquire, time to listen, time to engage in meaningful conversations. And in doing so, perhaps building in time for understanding and for compassion. And then perhaps thinking about whether it's time to act. In order to do this, each and every one of us has to carve out time in relation to our interactions with others. And in doing so, reclaim the act of caring about. For me, this is a fundamental starting point. and it's something that we have full control over. We could also consider sharing our efforts and experiences of caring about with others. And who knows what the ripple effects of such sharing might be.